As I mentioned earlier, the first voice we hear in Tristan und Isolde is that of an unseen young sailor. In his stage instructions, Wagner specifies that the singer should sound as if he's perched high upon the masthead, and that the performer is to remain invisible to the audience. The calculated anonymity of this role is further established by the fact that the part of the young sailor isn't even listed in the cast of characters at the beginning of the score. By the customs of the opera houses of Wagner's day, such an unbilled part would probably have been given to a singer of the lower ranks, most likely a member of the male chorus that Wagner employs in the work, and therefore quite possibly an amateur. Yet in this short passage of 24 bars, which the composer could reasonably expect to be sung by a performer of more modest capabilities, Wagner's inserted no less than 23 different instructions regarding such technical matters as mode of expression, phrasing, dynamics, and timing. One could easily go as many pages elsewhere in the score and not find this many specific demands on the singer's execution. One might wonder exactly what effect Wagner was trying to achieve that would require such precision, but for 22 of these markings, I'd certainly give the composer the benefit of the doubt. But the placement of one of them, in my opinion, makes absolutely no sense. This is the last diminuendo, the closed hairpin over the last notes but 3, that instruct the singer to lower the volume of his voice. Now, even at the moderately slow tempo that Wagner indicates for this passage, these notes simply go by too quickly for this vocal diminishment to be musically effective, especially considering that a good portion of the orchestra enters full force over the young sailor's final note. I've heard many performances of this passage, and I've yet to actually hear a singer execute this diminuendo with enough contrast to even be noticeable to an audience, let alone to be artistically expressive. The positioning of this closed hairpin is made even more dubious when we consider that the text that is set to these notes ends with an exclamation point. Wagner's telling the singer to lower his voice and exclaim. I know that I'm not the first to find this marking questionable. Hans von Bülow created the first piano vocal score of Tristan und Isolde, and he made his reduction even as Wagner was composing the piece. Apparently, he also found this closed hairpin to be superfluous because he simply omitted it. He took it out. But we know that von Bülow's editorial solution is in violation of our second rule. On our path through the Tristan Code, we can't afford to be so dismissive. We saw earlier that of 121 notational symbols in the Sailor song, all but 11 are in groups of 1, 2, 4, 7, or 11. This group of outliers consists of 3 piano signs, 3 forte signs, and 5 phrase marks. And our dragon's tongue tells us that their collective total of 11 indicates that they need to be first considered as a group. We can quickly note that the piano and forte signs alternate with one another, which is hardly surprising, but when we look closer we can also see that all the piano signs are placed at the beginning of a phrase mark, and every forte sign falls on the first note after a phrase mark. The dynamic markings frame the phrase markings, and Wagner expects us to recognize this pattern of alternating initials at the end of these gracefully curving lines. He's once again referring us to Gottfried von Strasberg's Tristan. Gottfried tells us that it was Isolde's cousin Brangäne that devised a method for Tristan to use in order to arrange the couple's clandestine meetings. These were held at night under an olive tree, and Brangäne instructed Tristan to cut slivers from an olive branch, and on one side to carve his initial T, and on the other side Isolde's initial I. He was then to place these in a brook upstream from the place where Isolde and Brangäne spent their afternoons. The initialed slivers would drift down the brook to the watchful ladies, and Isolde would know to meet with Tristan that night. Wagner has faithfully replicated Tristan's signal with the carved initials of his dynamic markings placed on either side of the olive slivers of his phrase marks. Perhaps, like Isolde, we're being directed to a rendezvous. But as in the story of the ivy and the vine, Wagner also expects us to recognize that Gottfried's telling of the episode of the drifting messengers is but one of many. Now, Gottfried added in the detail of the carved initials in order to satisfy his own agenda, but in previous tellings, Tristan was only instructed to cut the slivers in a particular way in order that they be recognizable. One story only says that the olive branches were carved skillfully, but another claims that Tristan cut them in such a manner that they curled and floated upright in the current like little sailboats. Wagner's skillfully carved little boats are the phrase marks. These are placed in a palindromic arrangement. First a single phrase mark, then 3 grouped together, then another single phrase mark. The intentional palindromic nature of this pattern is further established when we count the number of notes under each of these phrase marks. 6 under the first, and then 8 under each of the next 3, and finally 6 notes under the last. But these stories of carved olive branches are simply elaborations of an older version of the story. Here, to make his drifting signals distinctive, Tristan cut small branches and then split them lengthwise so that they forked apart. And now we can see that that final closed hairpin that seems so musically mislocated is, for Wagner's purposes, just in the right place. The hairpins are Wagner's forked branches, and they're arranged in a repeating pattern. 2 open hairpins, then a closed hairpin, then 2 more open, and then our final closed hairpin. But even this story of the forked branches is but a variation on what may be the oldest of these tales of Tristan's drifting signals. In this earlier, more primitive telling, the carving and shaping is omitted, and Tristan simply places pieces of bark and broken twigs in the brook. Wagner cleverly replicates this version of the story by using quarter rests for his pieces of bark and eighth rests for his broken twigs. These two follow a pattern of alternation: quarter rest, eighth rest, then eighth rest, quarter rest. This sequence then repeats, but with an alternation of its components: eighth rest, quarter rest, eighth rest. With his arrangement of these notational symbols in the Sailor Song, Wagner has given us a set of abstract patterns that at their most basic are each comprised of two elements. These are an A-B alternation, an A-B-A palindrome, an A-A-B sequence, and an A-B-B-A palindromic alternation. But of course, these are more than abstract patterns. Wagner is showing us these structures so that we'll recognize them when we see them again. We can now see that our dragon's tongue was only part of the information contained in the Sailor Song. The discovery of Wagner's hidden patterns leads us to a re-examination of how we got where we are, just in case we've missed something. We discovered our number sequence, the dragon's tongue, by not only enumerating the musical symbology in the Sailor Song, but also by noting how the notes are divided into groups by the structural markers, the key and time signatures. There's yet another way that these notes are grouped, reflecting a more musical division. This is the number of notes in each melodic phrase. The first of these contains 11 notes. The next phrase has 9 notes, as does the next. Then follow 2 phrases, each having 8 notes. Notice that these two 8-note phrases each contain a grace note. By another method of musical enumeration, these could be considered ornaments, separate from the notes themselves, and therefore each of these phrases would consist of 7 notes, with one of them having an attached embellishment. But generally speaking, we would say that these phrases each contain 8 notes. These are followed by 2 more equal phrases, both having 6 notes. The sailor song then ends with the final phrase of 11 notes. Of all the hidden clues and coded directives Wagner has left us in the Tristan Code, the cleverest, the wittiest, and the most entertaining of them is, in my opinion, the encryption he's placed in these numbers. He's given us a most ingenious puzzle. First, we need to simply place them all into a single string. 11, 9, 9, 8, 8, 6, 6, and 11. Then we simply remember our admonition to always remember to look both ways. I'll save you having to stand on your head. Within the 8 melodic phrases of the sailor song, Wagner has given us a string of numbers that form a backwards and upside down palindrome. Moreover, he's given us 2 repetitions of a single string, 11, 9, 9, 8. One is simply upside down. And of course, recall that the 8-note phrases could also be considered to have had 7 notes, and therefore Wagner is actually implying 2 different numbers with this single string, 11997 and 11998. I think Wagner was quite confident that by this point we'd have enough familiarity with Gottfried von Strasberg's Tristan that we'd recognize the significance of these numbers. Gottfried's poem consists of 19,548 lines, and when the text is referenced, it's generally by line number. Gottfried's story begins before the birth of Tristan, but Wagner's story begins much later with the voyage to Cornwall, a point that's roughly equivalent to Gottfried's line 11,530. Tristan and Isolde drink the love potion at a point around Gottfried's line 11,683. Lines 11,997 and 11,998 come at a point in the story where Tristan has a puzzle of his own to solve, and his solution to this puzzle will now be ours. Tristan and Isolde have begun to feel the effects of the love potion, but neither can be sure of the other. Tristan asks Isolde what is troubling her, and in her answer she 3 times uses the word LAMEIR, which can have 3 different meanings depending on context and dialect. LAMEIR could mean love, as in l'amour, but Meyer can mean bitter, and there's la mer, the sea. Now, if you or I asked a young woman aboard a tossing ship what bothered her and got this answer, we'd probably assume her to be unwell. We'd hardly expect her to be telling us that she's in love. But Isolde knows that if Tristan feels the same way she does, he'll know that he needs more information. Lines 11,997 and 11,998 are a couplet, and they're Tristan's means of solving Isolde's puzzle. Übersagte dir ein und fragte von den Zweien. He left out one of the 3 and asked about the other 2. Tristan leaves out one of the 3 possible meanings, love, and asks about the other 2. He asks Isolde if the sea distresses her, or if the sea and wind make her bitter. Her reply is that neither the sea nor air bothers her. LAMEIR alone is the cause of her distress. It's only right that we should acknowledge the ingenuity and imagination Wagner demonstrates with this delightful encryption. And by sending us to these 2 very explicit lines, he's quite helpfully provided us more than just a single directive with a single intention. With this simple couplet, Wagner has given us a reliable axiom, an easily remembered rule of thumb that will apply again and again. Isolde's clever use of the ambiguous word LAMEIR allowed the couple to confirm their feelings for one another without risk of exposure, establishing a mutual understanding that marks a turning point in Gottfried's story. From this moment on, Tristan and Isolde are inseparably bound, not only by the love potion, but also because they share a secret that must be maintained at all costs, the deceit that this necessitates, and the ensuing suspicion and surveillance become major themes of the story. It's the secrecy at the heart of his ancient tale, and Tristan and Isolde's constant risk of detection that led Gottfried to embed a secret of his own within his text, and also to insert subtle clues as to how it can be discovered. Wagner's reference to the LAMEIR episode likewise marks a turning point on our path through the Tristan Code. Wagner's gone to the trouble of sending us 2 specific lines of Gottfried's poem. The lines themselves are of course very significant to us, but there's also a wider statement being made here. Wagner's telling us that beyond simply reflecting elements of his story, the Tristan Code is intrinsically linked to Gottfried's original text, in his original language. And therefore, to solve it further, we must look much more closely at Gottfried von Strasberg's exact words. And in the next installment of the Tristan Code, we'll do just that. We'll arrive at that rendezvous the composer just arranged with us, where we'll see how Gottfried's words inspired one of Richard Wagner's most stunning creations.